In the spring of 1348, Florence was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Its population sat somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people, crowded inside stone walls. The wool trade moved through it. Banking moved through it. Letters, contracts, grain, all of it. The city ran on paper and proximity. People close together. Always. That detail mattered more than anyone understood at the time. The plague did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way most catastrophes do, as a rumor, then a few cases, then suddenly everywhere. Genoese ships had carried it from the Black Sea ports into Messina in late 1347. By January 1348, it was moving up the Italian peninsula with quiet speed. Florence's merchant networks, the very thing that made the city rich, helped carry it in. Boccaccio, who was in Florence that year, described swellings the size of an egg or apple. They appeared first in the armpit or groin, then darkened, then spread. Some people died within 3 days, some within hours. A few survived, for reasons no one could explain. There were 2 forms moving through the city simultaneously, though no one had that framework. The bubonic form came from flea bites. The pneumonic spread through the air between people. In a city where workshops, markets, and parish churches packed people together daily, this was catastrophic. The Florentine health infrastructure, such as it was, had no concept of bacterial transmission. Physicians worked within the Galenic tradition. Disease came from corrupted air, called miasma, so the responses made internal sense even when they did nothing useful. People burned aromatic woods in the streets to purify the air. They avoided low-lying areas near the river, believing bad vapors rose from standing water. Some carried posies of herbs, some sealed their windows, some fled. The city government, the Signoria, did attempt practical measures relatively quickly. They banned the import of goods from infected areas. They tried to isolate the sick. They organized the removal of corpses, which became the most visible and relentless task of that summer. By June, the dead were accumulating faster than families could manage them. The normal Florentine burial, a procession, a priest, a grave in consecrated ground, collapsed. Gravediggers, called bacchini, became some of the most necessary and most feared people in the city. They earned high wages because few would do the work, and many of them died doing it. Boccaccio wrote that bodies were laid in rows in churches, stacked like merchandise on a ship. That phrase is his, and historians treat it with some caution. Boccaccio was also a literary man, but the broad picture he describes is consistent with other sources from the period. What the records make clear is that the ordinary social fabric began to tear in specific, observable ways. People stopped visiting the sick, even family members. This is described not as cowardice in the sources, but as rational fear. A city built on face-to-face trust. The handshake of a merchant, the word of a notary, had to change. Contracts went unsigned. Courts slowed. Wool orders sat incomplete in workshops that had lost half their workers. The economic damage was not just death. It was the interruption of every system that required continuity. Apprentices died before their masters. Masters died without passing on their knowledge. Guild records from this period show sudden gaps. Members listed, then nothing, then a new name. Unfamiliar. The church, which organized so much of daily Florentine life, was also devastated. Priests died in large numbers, partly because last rites required physical proximity to the dying. Some parishes lost their entire clergy. Others had priests from elsewhere, strangers, filling in. The spiritual infrastructure of the city, confession, absolution, burial rites, strained and in places broke. For a population that genuinely believed dying without last rites endangered the soul, this was not a small thing. It produced a specific kind of fear that sat alongside the physical fear of illness. By the end of 1348, Florence had lost somewhere between a third and more than half its population. The range is wide because the records are incomplete, damaged, and in some cases simply missing. Historians still debate the exact figure, and it likely varied by neighborhood, by occupation, by proximity to trade routes. What is not debated is that the city that emerged from 1348 was a different city in practical terms. The labor market had been destroyed and then rebuilt under completely different pressures. Workers who survived found themselves for perhaps the first time in generations in short supply. Wages rose. Lords and employers pushed back, tried to legislate the old rates back into place. In Florence specifically, the aftermath would feed into social tensions that ran through the next several decades. The survivors inherited property, debts, and vacant workshops all at once. A young man who had been a junior wool carder in March might be running the operation by December, not because he was ready, but because everyone above him was gone. That kind of compressed, unearned advancement left its own marks on the city's culture. Florence had always been a place where status was negotiated, displayed, contested. Sumptuary laws tried to regulate what people wore, what they spent on weddings, how they mourned. After 1348, those laws had to be rewritten and reinforced repeatedly, which tells you something. People who had moved up suddenly wanted to dress the part. The city kept trying to stop them. There is something almost bureaucratically exhausting about reading those repeated ordinances. The plague also changed the texture of Florentine religious life in ways that lasted for generations. Flagellant movements, which had existed before, intensified across northern Italy in 1348. Groups of men would move through streets beating themselves, publicly as acts of penance. Florence's authorities were uneasy about these processions. They were difficult to control. The city had always preferred religion organized through parishes and guilds, not roving crowds. The relationship between the church and ordinary Florentines shifted in subtler ways too. When priests had died in numbers, when rites had been delayed or skipped, people noticed. Some turned inward. Some turned toward private devotion. Saints, cults, personal relics. The massive wave of charitable bequests and wills from 1348 suggests people bargaining with uncertainty. Hospitals, orphanages, and chapels received endowments from people who had never given before. Whether this was faith, fear, or guilt is probably impossible to cleanly separate. What it produced, materially, was a changed city. More chapels, more institutions, more visible piety. The art commissioned in Florence in the decades after 1348 reflected this too. Images of death became more direct, crucifixions more physical, saints more present and personal. This was not unique to Florence, but Florence's artistic output was dense enough to track closely. Some historians argue the plague accelerated the shift toward the individual in Italian art and thought. Others are more cautious, pointing out that many of those tendencies were already developing before 1348. The plague did not create the Renaissance. That framing is too clean, too convenient. What it did was compress time, remove people, redistribute wealth, and scramble expectations. Whether that counts as acceleration or disruption depends on which thread you are following. One thing that is often underemphasized is the effect on children who survived. Florence, in the 1350s, had a significant population of orphans, children whose parents, masters, and guardians had died. The city's institutions were not built to absorb that number, and the records show improvisation everywhere. Children placed with distant relatives, with neighbors, with anyone who would take them. Some ended up in the wool workshops young, working earlier than they otherwise would have. The generation that came of age in the 1360s had, in many cases, grown up inside the wreckage. That is not a metaphor, it is a practical description of what the city looked like for over a decade. Buildings stood empty. Some streets had houses with no living owner on record. The city government spent years trying to resolve property disputes generated by families that had simply ended. Legal records from the 1350s and 1360s in Florence show this clearly. Inheritance cases, contested wills, missing heirs. A notary working in that period would have spent a significant portion of his time untangling the dead. The plague returned. That is the part people often forget when they discuss 1348 as a single event. It came back to Florence in 1363, again in 1374, again in 1383, and at irregular intervals after that. Each return killed fewer people than 1348, partly because the population was smaller, partly because some immunity existed. But each return reset the psychological clock. The fear never fully left the city. Florentines, in the late 14th century, planned around plague, the way people plan around seasons. Wealthy families had country villas partly for this reason, somewhere to go when the city became dangerous. Boccaccio's Decameron, which he wrote in the years after 1348, is structured around exactly this retreat. 10 people leave Florence for the hills and tell stories while the city dies below them. Whether that felt like escapism or realism to its first readers is an interesting question. Possibly both. The city that came out of 1348 was smaller, wealthier per capita in some ways, more anxious, and more aware that systems break, that proximity kills, that institutions built for normal times do not hold under pressure. Florence did not collapse. That is worth stating plainly. It rebuilt, it adapted, it kept its banking networks and its guild structures largely intact. But it rebuilt as a city that had been through something it could not fully explain, could not fully prevent, and could not fully stop. The responses, the bonfires, the flight, the locked doors, the rewritten wills, were not failures of intelligence. They were the best available tools applied to a disease that would not be understood for another 5 centuries. As with much of what we know about 1348, details vary depending on which sources survive and who recorded them. Boccaccio saw it. Notaries recorded it. The church tried to manage it. The city government improvised. What they left behind is enough to understand in reasonably close detail how a city breaks quietly. Not with a single collapse, but piece by piece. A missed burial, an unsigned contract, an empty workshop, a child placed with strangers.